Welcome to the channel Ephraim. Today we will discuss a prophecy in Ezekiel that could fit along with the analogy of a woman experiencing birthing pains, as Jesus uses this analogy to describe the events leading up to his return. Today, Aswan is the southernmost city in the country of Egypt. During biblical times, Aswan was called Syene, and Syene was considered to be the gateway leading into Egypt from the south due to the mighty Nile River flowing from south to north. In the BDB lexicon, Syene is defined as her veiling, which means the beauty of Egypt is unveiled to southern travelers at Syene. This is where it gets interesting. Ezekiel references a landmark that did not exist when he was writing this future prophetic destruction of Egypt. There was simply no tower during Ezekiel's time period. In fact, nothing of significance was built until the 1960s and 1970s when Russia helped Egypt build a massive hydroelectric dam which is known as the Aswan Dam. The Aswan Dam is considered indestructible by many. It is a huge, massive concrete structure. The Aswan Dam has measured 360 feet in height, 10,200 feet long, which is almost 2 miles, and 3,200 feet wide at the base. The Aswan Dam holds back the waters of Lake Nasser. And guess what was built to commemorate the Russian involvement in the construction of the Aswan Dam? It would become known as an Egyptian-Russian friendship monument. They built the Lotus Tower. The Lotus Tower is what Ezekiel referred to as the Tower of Syene. Now that we can correctly identify God's symbolism spoken through his prophet Ezekiel, we can better understand the Egyptian prophecy that was written 2,000 plus years ago. Isn't Jehovah God truly the one true God, the only God to name the end from the very beginning? How amazing is it that God gave Ezekiel a vision of a tower that wouldn't be built until the 1960s or 1970s, our generation, what the Bible calls the fig tree generation. That is truly amazing. And God does this all throughout the Bible to validate that he alone is Jehovah God. He did it with Malachi. Malachi symbolically named John the Baptist because John the Baptist wasn't born. So Malachi gave him the symbolic name of Elijah. He does it. He's done it. There's all types of examples. And now he's done it again through Ezekiel. Ezekiel named symbolically the Aswan Dam and the Lotus Tower because they were not built at the time Ezekiel received the vision, which is why Ezekiel gave them the symbolic name of the Tower of Syene. Now I get it. A lot of Christians still don't understand this futuristic destruction of Egypt. They think it's already taken place. They think Egypt has already been destroyed like this at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. However, we are going to look at what today's modern scientists and engineers say would happen to Egypt if the Tower of Syene falls. It's truly amazing because Jehovah God specifically says what's going to happen. We're going to quickly look at these verses. What would happen if the Aswan Dam failed to hold back the waters of Lake Nasser? Just type in Google, what happens if the Aswan Dam breaks? Here's the answer I got. There would be a tidal wave of such magnitude that Egypt would cease to exist as a nation. Now, I want you to keep this contemporary explanation in mind as we look at what Jehovah God says through Ezekiel some 2,000 plus years ago. We're going to cover these verses really quickly, starting with Ezekiel chapter 29 using the King James Version. The first verse is just a timestamp of when Ezekiel received this prophecy from Jehovah God. The problem is we already know that ancient Egypt was destroyed by ancient Babylon. So how can we know the difference of when Ezekiel is describing the ancient destruction of Egypt, opposed to when Ezekiel is describing the futuristic destruction of Egypt. Read verse 2. Ezekiel is not specific by naming the ruler of Egypt. He uses the phrase Pharaoh, king of Egypt. When this happens, and Ezekiel is not specific, we know that these verses can be left up to interpretation. Keep this in mind as we study the destruction of Egypt. Most Christians want to know why. Why is God going to allow Egypt to be destroyed? Verse 3 explains, Egypt has been deceived by the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers. Well, how do we know Egypt is deceived? Well, to answer that, you have to know the identity of the great dragon. John in Revelation 12:9 identifies the great dragon as the devil, Satan. And the devil has deceived Egypt into taking ownership of the Nile River by building the Aswan Dam. Look at the next phrase. My river is mine own. God created that river. Yet Egypt has taken ownership of the river by building the dam, placing themselves in a path of destruction. Christians want to know when. When is the destruction of Egypt going to take place? God lets us know through Ezekiel that he is in control of the timing by using the phrase, put hooks in thy jaws. I can't help but make a comparison to Ezekiel 38:4, when Ezekiel describes God putting hooks in the jaws of the Magog army to pull them out. So my thinking is God will put hooks in the jaws of the Egyptian army and pull them out. Look at the next part of the verse. I will cause the fish of thy rivers to stick unto thy scales. The ancient Egyptian army wore armor that looked like the scales on a fish. Therefore, God is going to pull out the Egyptian army. Look at the next part of the verse. I will bring thee up out of the midst of thy rivers. I can't help but think of Daniel 7:5, when Daniel explains that the bear is going to raise up on one of its sides, referring to population density, the bear being symbolic for Russia. Raising up on one of its sides being symbolic for the majority of the Russian people living in the western part of Russia. Well, here, the majority of the Egyptian people live along the Nile, and God is going to pull them up out of thy rivers, meaning you'll see this army raise up. And look at the last part of the verse. And all the fish of thy rivers shall stick unto thy scales. In other words, I'll use the old mafia term, they're going to die with the fishes. So let me explain real quick in verse 5, 6, and 7 why I refer to the Egyptian army dying with the fishes. Picture a river that floods. As the water recedes, some of the fish are trapped on the banks in the shallow spots. As that water evaporates, they die in the open land. That's what verse 5 is explaining. They're going to die in the wilderness, and nobody's going to gather them to bury them. Now, that's a very interesting part of this verse, and we're going to explain that in verse 10, 11, and 12. So keep that in mind as we go over that. God says he's going to give them his meat to the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven. Verse 6, everybody's going to know that Jehovah God is the one true God. The reason being is because Egypt, verse 6 and 7, Egypt could easily stop the Gaza Strip from committing their terrorist attacks against Israel. This verse explains they've been a staff of reed to the house of Israel. The staff of reed, that's like a hollow stick. When you lean on it, it breaks and shatters and splinters. Egypt controls the Gaza Strip. They could easily have them stop their terrorist attacks, but they choose not to. Well, God's had enough, and now judgment's coming on them. Therefore, God has had enough. God is against them. He's going to bring a sword upon them, which means he's going to wipe them out. He's going to cut off man and beast out of thee. Verse 11 goes into explaining how that's going to take place. Verse 9, Egypt's going to be desolate and waste. And he says that phrase again, and they are going to know that he is Jehovah God. Because, here's their reason, they've claimed ownership to something that God has created. And because of that, the very thing that they have built will lead to their demise. You remember verse 8? You want to know how God is going to cut off man and beast out of Egypt? Verse 11, no foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast shall pass through it, neither shall it be inhabited for 40 years. Egypt will not be allowed to be inhabited for 40 years. This verse does not make sense. It's just a flood. It's just a tidal wave. How is it possible for the destruction of the Aswan Dam, the Tower of Syene, to affect Egypt for 40 years? We're going to have to explain that later. Verse 12, I will make the land of Egypt desolate in the midst of countries that are desolate. It's also going to affect the countries around it, in other words. And her cities among the cities that are laid waste shall be desolate 40 years. And I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and will disperse them through the countries. Do you remember at the beginning of the video where we discussed many Egyptians feel like the Aswan Dam is indestructible? Well, that isn't true. The Aswan Dam would breach due to a nuclear attack. For me, that is what Ezekiel is describing. Go to these two videos where I already discussed the nuclear destruction of Egypt at the hands of symbolic Babylon. I go over the phrases in the bottom video. The top video, I go over the effect the radiation has on the animals or the beast of the field, as Ezekiel calls it, what he refers to as noisome beast. Think with me for 1 second. Doesn't it make sense now? Symbolic Babylon is going to pull up in their ships, use nuclear weapons to destroy the Aswan Dam. The radiation from these nuclear weapons is going to contaminate the water. That water is going to be a tidal wave that is spread all throughout Egypt, leaving the land desolate or uninhabitable for 40 years. This explains why Egyptians are forced to scatter to other countries. This explains why Egyptians do not gather their dead for burial. It explains why Egypt is uninhabitable for 40 years, which means no foot of man or beast can pass through Egypt, much less live there. Please go to those two videos so you can get a better understanding of how Egypt is going to be destroyed. At the beginning of this video, on the thumbnail, we posed a question. Jesus uses the analogy of a pregnant woman experiencing birthing pains leading up to his return. Is it possible? Is it possible that the destruction of Egypt is the water-breaking event that could keep with the analogy that Jesus is using? We all know when a woman's water breaks, that is a sign to her that she better get to the hospital because the baby is on the way. Is it possible that when Egypt is destroyed, that is the water-breaking event for Christians around the world to recognize that they were chosen to live during the generation to witness these events leading up to Christ's return? It is something to think about. It is something to share with your family and friends about. Maybe you disagree. I don't know. I hope that you have faith enough to share this video around the world with as many as you can, in hopes that if Egypt is destroyed, maybe Jesus would find you worthy to escape the destruction coming to a country near you, possibly a country you live in. There will be countries that are going to be destroyed. Ukraine is experiencing destruction right now. Destruction for Egypt is coming. Destruction for a mystery Babylon, the same Babylon that's going to destroy Egypt, is going to get destroyed. These things will happen because it's in God's word. Please share this video so that people will know what's coming before it comes, so that when it gets here, when it happens, then they will believe. Then they will know that Jehovah God is the one true God. Go to the website above, download the free booklet. The man on this website is the first human to write about the destruction of Egypt. It is worth reading. in my opinion, I would download the free booklet because my videos get censored. That way you will have a copy of these events that are going to lead up to Christ's return. Y'all, that's my time. Subscribe to the channel. We're going to do 2 more videos going over the destruction of Egypt that we're going to see in the near future. I've enjoyed it. Y'all know the drill. Peace out. I'm chilling.